Uh, Good morning and welcome to Congressional Cemetery again. My name is Robert Pohl. I'm going to be your guide today. I'm going to take you through some of the sections of the cemetery that I usually don't get a chance to showing people on these tours. If you watched my tour about a month ago, you'll know that I'll tell you now because you probably couldn't tell. We basically headed east and then sort of swung back around to pretty much right where I'm standing right now. Today we're actually going to be looking at another part of the cemetery over here in the west part. My problem, of course, is that I get so hung up on the various graves that I go by that I run out of time. So this is great. It gives me a chance to go back and talk about some of the people I don't usually get a chance to talk about. And we're going to start right here with Adelaide Johnson. Now, she is a fascinating character, and one thing that just struck me when I came by to have a look at this is that this is a remarkably mundane tomb marker, grave marker here. And given that the woman was a sculptor, you really would expect something a little more exciting than this, right? But yes, she was a sculptor, born 1859, although she always claimed that she was born about 10 years earlier. She liked to talk about how she had met Abraham Lincoln during his first run for president, which is a little unlikely given that she would have been a year old at the time, but it was only after she died that they realized that she wasn't actually 105 years old but only 94. So still pretty impressive age, especially given her history. She was obviously very talented as a sculptor right off the bat. She was born in the Midwest, went to Chicago, and was hired there to carve wood on some project. Unfortunately, this project had her walk past a open elevator shaft that she fell into, 15 feet down, broke her hip, which is not a good thing for a sculptor. However, she managed to make the best of it because she actually sued the company whose elevator shaft it was, won $15,000, and used that money to travel to Europe and become a much better sculptor. In fact, she switched it up from wood to marble, and that's what she worked in over the next decades. Along the way, she became sort of the sculptor of the women's suffragette movement. And over time, she sculpted busts of a lot of the famous suffragettes. So that 1920-21, when women's suffrage had passed, she was the obvious person to ask to make a memorial to the women getting the vote. So the problem was that most of the women who had been important in that in the 19th century had died. She was the only one that had actually worked with these people, so she was a really good, for multiple reasons, was an excellent choice here. Now, I have to say, I'm not an art historian or art critic or anything like that. I get a little bit, I try to fake it a little bit, of course, as a tour guide, because that's what we do. But I have to question some of the choices she made in this, it's called the Portrait Monument, it's called. It's actually in the Capitol, the Rotunda of the Capitol, but I'll explain that in a moment. So, the Portrait Monument is a big hunk of marble with 3 women's busts stuck in it. Those women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Susan B. Anthony. The problem is that they're kind of like we're all kind of looking in different directions, and it's just from here up, because when she had originally done their portraits, that's all she'd done, so that's all she had to work with. But it's really kind of a strange, enormous hunk of marble, 3 heads sticking out of it. So it's generally referred to as the 3 women in the bathtub. I try not to use that when I'm showing it to 8th graders because, they're irreverent enough as it is. But there is one story that has come up from this memorial, because not only are there the 3 heads, but at the back there is a lump of unfinished marble. And the story went around that this unfinished lump was to be used to carve the head of the first female president whenever she was elected. Now, there's multiple problems with that story, not the least of which is that no self-respecting artist, or frankly any artist, would take a chisel to a completed work, 100-year-old completed work of art. The other thing is that it's much too small, really, so the head would be about the size of my fist instead of the size of the other women's heads, so that would look completely ridiculous. And in fact, Ms. Johnson did say in her life that she felt that this unfinished lump represented the unfinished work of women's rights that was being shown there. That yes, suffrage was an excellent first step here, but there was still a long way to go. She was absolutely right in that, of course. So Ms. Johnson lived here on Capitol Hill, Maryland Avenue, 2nd, something like that. She actually became very poor late in her life. There was an Adelaide Johnson Foundation that sort of tried to help support her, and they're in fact the ones that were responsible for having her buried here. But she herself was basically living with friends of hers by the end of her life. She unfortunately was not able to sort of capitalize on her success as an artist to also make money off of it. Quite in contrast to our next stop. We're going to head this way. Now, the other thing that is important as a tour guide is to stay in the shade, especially on days like this. Now, today you're comfortably at home, so I don't have to really worry about that, but I'm going to stick in the shade as much as possible. But yes, the things that they don't teach you in tour guide school. I was walking around here earlier. The birds were particularly loud. It was very nice. But it was very nice. Seemed to enjoy the peace and quiet of the Saturday morning here, much like I do. So our next stop is going to be John Philip Sousa, but as we go by, I want to point out Mr. Herbert Lincoln Clark here, who is listed on his gravestone as the world's premier cornetist and bandmaster. Now, the bandmaster, I don't know if he's also supposed to be the world's, the world's premier bandmaster, but he is actually known amongst cornetists as one of the famous guys. Now, I'm not a cornetist, so I'd never heard of him before, but people that do play the cornet that come by here get very excited to see this grave. So in his realm, he is indeed quite famous. But moving on here to somebody that everybody knows, John Philip Sousa. I'm going to stay right here. I think this is a good view from the shade of John Philip Sousa's grave. Now, we have a lot of people. We have a lot of important people here in Congressional Cemetery, vice presidents and attorneys general and that sort of thing. But I still think that Sousa here is really and truly our favorite son. I mean, he was born here on Capitol Hill, worked for many years on Capitol Hill, ended up back here after he died. I think that really does count. And hey, who doesn't like a good military march? Well, don't answer that question. It's John Philip Sousa, as I said, born on G Street, 2 doors down from Christ Church, who were, of course, the owners of this cemetery at the time, a block and a half from the Marine Barracks, where his father played in the Marine Band. When he was 13, the circus came to town. And as so many 13-year-olds before him, Sousa decided to run away with the circus. At least this is the way the story is told. Not what I'm researching, okay? So his mother found out about this and was not happy. So she grabbed him and dragged him over to the Marine Barracks. I like to think that it was sort of, one of these, dragging him by the ear. But she signed him up to be in the Marine Band. And that was actually a really good choice. He was extremely good at what he did. He rapidly rose through the ranks and became the head of the Marine Band. He was really incredibly popular. And the only problem that he had was that he wasn't making any money off of this, because of course, he was writing all these marches, but you're not making money when you're working for the U.S. government. Anything you produce you can't copyright. So he actually eventually struck out on his own and made a lot of money. But he did come back to the Marine Band during the First World War to lead them again. So, I mean, he didn't forget where he had come from. Now, one of his most famous pieces is called the Washington Post March. Kind of an interesting story about that because, today we think of, he must have been, hanging his fame on the fame of the Washington Post. I mean, the Post remains one of the best newspapers, most important newspapers here in the country. So, writing about that, it seems like he's trying to get a little bit of the reflected glory. It was actually quite the opposite. At the time, the Post was not, it was actually a fairly new newspaper, if nothing else, and it had actually just been recently bought. The important newspaper at the time was the Evening Star. So the Post was sort of the scrappy underdog, and by hiring Sousa to write a march for some event that they were putting on, they were actually using his fame to sort of build themselves up. So interesting how that has changed over the years. Now, one last thing about Sousa, and one of the reasons why I'm stopping here today, is that Sousa was, I mean, he was a notorious self-promoter. I mean, he was kind of great in some ways. One of the stories he would tell, wherever he went in the world, he would try to connect with a local audience by claiming that he came from, or his family came from, that area. Now, with a name like Sousa, which is obviously Portuguese, that doesn't really work very well, right? But he had a way around that. What he said was that the Sousa wasn't really his real name. Rather, it came from his initials, S-O-U-S-A. So in Germany, he would call himself Sigismund Ox, and then S-O-U-S-A. And the reason why he had gotten this name is that on his trunks, there were just his initials and then USA. So that's where Sousa came from. That's what he claimed. It got printed credulously in many newspapers around the world. Of course, absolutely no truth to it, but I love how he used every little trick that he could to connect with his audience. All right, we're going to head around the corner here. So after 9/11, of course, a whole slew of memorials were planned, built. One of them was actually to put a memorial in every one of the wards of Washington, D.C. And the idea was that it would be a tree, a grove, or some agglomeration of trees. Now, Congressional Cemetery was given that honor here in Ward 6. Most places it's in a park or at a school. I think one it's along a street. But here, the cemetery seemed like a good choice. The only problem is, of course, there's no sort of open areas that you can plant up. But they did have this walkway, so they decided that they would plant an Allee, which, of course, that's German for tree-lined street. Same word basically as alley, which has nothing to do with tree-lined anything. But anyway, so Allee rather than alley. And we have here these trees leading down, and we will head this way right away. It's really, this was planted just a few years after 9/11. Since then, it's really grown together nicely. It's a wonderful place to walk today. They're actually working on adding left and right some bricks, and if you want to pay for a brick with your name on it, or something, an important phrase like knowledge is good, here's your opportunity to add a little bit to the 9/11 memorial here at Congressional Cemetery. I actually, when I was researching, making sure that I remembered all the important bits of information about this, I did come across sort of the Wikipedia page of all 9/11 memorials, and it goes on for pages. It's really kind of amazing how much of an outpouring there was. Now, at the end of the alley here is one of those very DC things, namely a temporary structure that seems to become permanent. There's nothing as permanent in DC as something provisional. On the other hand, this is one situation where I'm really happy that it's here. I think this is actually an amazing structure here. It is a peace arch built by the or healing poles built by the Lummi tribe of Pacific Northwest in the Pacific Northwest. There's three parts to it: two poles that represent liberty and freedom, and then across the top the top, which is the sovereignty. So, but let's have a look at the actual thing rather than just a picture of it. It's really kind of an amazing thing. Not quite what you'd expect in a cemetery, but as I said, I'm perfectly okay with that. Now, the original idea was that along with the various groves in each of the wards of Washington, D.C., there would be one central place, one central memorial on Kingman Island, and this was supposed to be the centerpiece of that. So that was the decision when this was placed 2004, that sort of within a year would be moved to Kingman Island. We don't really know why. I think maybe Kingman Island has just become more of a nature preserve, so that this doesn't really sort of fit into the planning for it, or maybe people have simply forgotten about it. I don't really know, but as I said, for now, I'm very happy that this remains here and do hope that it stays. All right, we're going to head over here out into the sun and make sure that I don't lose my way. Let's see, I have to go to this. And that's between here and there. And so if any of you were on the Soul Strolls last year, you would have come out this way. You would have seen a guy with an enormous beard standing here and telling his tale of woe. That would be Mr. William Cross. We have this tombstone right here. Now, William Cross was worked at the Navy Yard. He was engineer there. He worked on motors and that sort of thing. And when Andrew Greeley was putting together the Lady Franklin Bay expedition in the 1880s, early 1880s, that was actually an Army expedition, but they needed somebody with engineering skills to help along that. He kind of got drafted into this. It wasn't what he wanted to do, I suspect, and certainly wasn't what he wanted. Once he got there, it certainly wasn't what he had signed up for or what he thought he was getting into. So the Lady Franklin Bay expedition the idea was that they would be sent up sort of between Greenland and Canada up towards the North Pole. They would stop, they would get let off there, they would winter there, and then next year a ship would come up, pick them up, and take them home. And in that time, they would try to see how close they could get to the North Pole and sort of explore the area. Unfortunately, the summer that they went up was probably the warmest that it had been for many, many years. They got much further up, the ships got much further up before running into ice than they would have normally done. And so that meant that the ships that tried to pick them up over the next couple of years failed. In the end, actually, the expedition sort of moved a little bit further down, and by the time that they that they were finally rescued of the 27, 28, something like that, men that had set out. Only 6 or 7 were still remained alive. I think 7 were still alive, and 1 died almost immediately after. I think that's what happened. But that's all kind of secondary to Mr. Cross here, who was actually the first person to die on the trip. And it's not too surprising. I mean, he was a very unpleasant man, which, okay, that's... but he was also an alcoholic, and he would be caught stealing the alcohol that they needed to operate their ships on and stuff like that, which is not a good thing to do. I don't think that anybody was terribly sad when he died, and he was buried there. They did go through the motions. I mean, later there was no real opportunity to go through the motions of any kind of burial, but they did bury him. They did actually go back and collect all the bodies later and bring them home. And when this sort of story started to creep out about some unpleasant things that had happened to the corpses there, and so they actually opened up one of the coffins of one of the men that had died, and it was clear that his body had been cut up after death. Of course, everyone immediately jumped to the conclusion that this cannibalism was involved. Others say no, it was just they're just using his flesh to as bait to catch fish. So we don't really know. One thing that we can be fairly certain of is that Cross was not one of those. Remember, he was the first one to die, and actually well before anybody else died. However, his coffin was never opened. He was buried right here, and that was sort of the end of it. If you're interested, actually, he lived here on Capitol Hill. If you know where Folger Park is, just north of Exparker. There, he's on 3rd Street, pretty close to the corner there on the east side. His house, actually, pretty nice house. So yeah, I'm sure he regretted very much his having to be sent to the Arctic. That was not what he was hoping for in his life. All right, we're going to continue on this way. So if you listened to my tour the other day, I stopped by the grave of Utsin Malakin, the Native American who died here in D.C. and was buried, and eventually was given a government-issue tombstone. I sort of briefly went over that, but I want to talk a little bit more about these government-issue tombstones. If you go to Arlington Cemetery, pretty much all of the gravestones look like this. They're this shape. They're a little bit bigger today, and the face is a little bit different. Today, there's always up at the top. There's a symbol indicating what religion they are. Below that, then the name and where they served and when they lived, etc. But it is basically this format that you'll see. And of course, you've seen pictures. If you haven't been to Arlington, you've seen pictures of exactly row upon row of these stones. So this is an important part of sort of military history, is how we honor those who have served the country. Now, after the Civil War, there was a problem, is that you had a lot of people that had served, that were Americans, but had served in the wrong war, or on the wrong side of the war, I should say. And so there was the question, well, how should they be buried? What sort of stone should you put on top of them? Obviously, putting this shape on them would send the wrong message, so they decided to go a little bit differently. So we're going to head over here to actually a whole row of Confederate graves that were put up here during and after the Civil War. And now, I don't know, unfortunately there's no dates on these, and since the cemetery isn't open, I haven't had a chance to go look at their records, but so I don't actually know if any of the Confederate soldiers buried here in Congressional Cemetery actually died in Lincoln Park, Lincoln Hospital. What's today Lincoln Park, began as a hospital and during the Civil War, and I know that after the Battle of Fort Stevens up the north of D.C., which is the one time the Confederate Army actually came close here to D.C., a number of wounded Confederate soldiers were found there and brought to Lincoln Hospital. Several of them died there, unsurprisingly, given the standards of care back then. The ones that I do know about got buried in Arlington Cemetery. What I don't know, and I'd love to find out, is if any got buried here at Congressional. It would make sense, after all, it was the closest cemetery to Lincoln Hospital at the time. But right now, I really just want to talk about the stones themselves. You notice that they're different, right? They're not rounded, but pointed at the top. And the story is told that that there is a reason for this, namely that no damn Yankees could sit on the stones. I have no idea if this is true. I've gotten as far as finding the bill that Congress passed that sort of created these stones, that defined what these stones would look like and how they would be used. But as you may be unsurprised, neither the word damn nor Yankee shows up in this text, and it wouldn't anyways, even if that had been the thing. So I don't really know, but that's the story. That's the reason why they're pointing. If you ask me, the reason is very simple: is they wanted something that looked different. And they didn't want flat. Flat had its own set of problems. Rounded was already used, so pointed was the obvious other possibility. Now we're going to head right behind here to a very, very different grave marker. Switching to...
Yeah.
All right. Okay, we're back. And we are back with Marion Alicia Kaylert. It's a lovely little statue. And it's obviously put up by parents who are deeply saddened by the loss of their daughter. Which, of course, this is early 20th century. She was about 10 years old. That happened a lot back then, and so it's unsurprising that parents would put something up like this. However, that's not really what I came here to talk about, because, of course, it's more the stories that have grown up around her. So the story goes that she is actually the first person to be killed by an automobile here in the District of Columbia. Well, somebody had to do it, right? And the thousands that die every year, somebody had to be the first. And so the story goes that it was actually she. This story has sort of been floating around for a while, and it's gotten sort of more elaborate over time, down to which brand of bread truck it was that ran her over. Somebody, about 10 years ago or something, became interested in the story and wondered what the truth of it was. Fact is that you can find out, anybody who dies here in the District of Columbia, there is a death certificate filed with the city. So it's just a matter of going to the proper authorities and getting that. And when they received that, they discovered that she had in fact died of kidney disease. Nothing about a car accident. And so another story bites the dust. I did actually go and try to figure out who the first person to was, and actually somebody else did the research. I just found, sort of followed their tracks there. It was a young child, actually, a young boy who was crossing the street at 15th and New York Avenue, right where it crosses into Pennsylvania Avenue there in front of the White House. He ran across the street, I don't know, to get to a peanut truck or something like that, and was run over actually by an electric truck, which I thought was sort of an odd little detail there. His mother tried to sue the owner of that truck. I don't think that got very far. Sadly, what I was not able to determine is where he was actually buried. It's not here at Congressional, that's for sure. But anyway, so Marion here, other than the fact that she has a really wonderful little statue on top, has no great significance, but it's still worth coming out here. We're almost at the edge of the cemetery at this point. It is worth coming out and having a look. Continue on this way. And here, I'm not going to go right up to this memorial to begin with. I'll talk about it from the shade here. Also gives you a better chance to see the whole thing because it is one of the tallest structures here in Congressional Cemetery. This is the Arsenal Memorial. Well, the Arsenal disaster of 1864 is kind of an interesting story in sort of a lot of different ways. So. The Arsenal, during the Civil War, of course, it was incredibly important that the North continued to produce enough armaments to fight the war. One of the places where that was done was here, what's today Fort McNair, sort of between the Anacostia and the Potomac rivers down there, south end of Southwest Washington D.C. That was where they made munitions, including gunpowder. The work there was done by young women. Obvious reasons, all the young men were off fighting, right? And you needed, somebody needed to do this work. So it was young women that were actually hired for this. Beyond that, it was actually often women whose brothers had fallen in the war that were hired for this because the brother was often the sole breadwinner in the family, and so getting a job at the Arsenal was very important to a lot of these young women during that time. It all went very tragic on that day in 1864 when there was the gunpowder drying outside, and that was a very hot day like today, and something set off the gunpowder, and a spark from that flew into the building where the young women were working. There was more munitions in that room than there should have been, and the whole thing went up in flames. Particularly tragic about this is that they should have been able to get out, except they were all wearing these enormous hoop skirts, which was the style at the time, and so a lot of them were killed by their clothing, because if they'd been wearing pants, they would have been able to make it out. So 21 young women died that day, and it's kind of interesting because at the time, so calculated out, about 500 soldiers were dying every day. But these 21 young women, that was such a shock to the country that it really went through all of the newspapers. And in fact, when they were buried, not all of them are buried here. A couple are buried with their families elsewhere here, and some are in other cemeteries. But the majority of them are right here. None other than Abraham Lincoln. President Abraham Lincoln came out here and spoke at the funeral of these people. It really was sort of a shocking thing. Again, in sort of refreshing my memory of this, I came across sort of a comparison to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, and that in this case, though, in spite of the shock, in spite of how much music generated, it didn't really change much because, after all, it was the middle of the war. Now, around the side, and we'll go by there in just a moment, there's the name of all the 21 women that died. But this statue, which was actually made by a guy named Flannery, he's also the one that did the first Lincoln statue here in the District of Columbia, which is down in front of in Judiciary Square today and remains there. Anyway, the names are out there. They're starting to crumble a little bit. It's the usual marble, problem with marble. So a few years ago, below another granite piece of stone was added with, once again, the names engraved. And it's actually sort of been taken on a little bit by the Irish ambassador, the Irish embassy here in Washington, D.C., because most of the young women that died that day were of Irish extraction. So it's kind of an interesting, when you come here, there are often going to be a little Irish flag there. Right now it looks like whoever's been in charge of it hasn't been here in a while. It's understandable that that some things are growing a little bit faster than they should, or that we would prefer them to. But we're going to go have a look at over here, and it kind of looks like the explosion to me now. But it's a little tough to tell. And then around the side, then the names of the women, or some of the women, around the other side there. All right, we're continuing on this way, and as so often I have to follow certain landmarks to find the next one. He's kind of hidden here, but he's very important to me, so I don't want to miss out on our next stop here. So this guy here is Bo Hickman. Now, Bo Hickman, I think the word ne'er-do-well was pretty much invented for this guy. So Robert Hickman, Bo, but known as Bo to everybody. He was a member of a fairly famous and wealthy, probably more importantly, Virginia family, but he was kind of the black sheep of the family. Eventually, his father gave him the money that he was to inherit, and Bo came up here to Washington, D.C., where he managed to spend that money pretty rapidly. When his father died, Bo actually went back, and his brother essentially bought him off again. He's like, all right, here's some more money, but that's it. We'll never see you again. So he did. So fine, came back to D.C., and again, spent all of his money. So after that, he kind of had to live by his wits. I mean, the idea of actually getting a job was completely out of the question. He did have certain rules that he lived by. Like, for instance, he had no problem ripping off a hotel, but he would always pay for his meals. How that works, I don't really know. But he also had no problem ripping off the conductors on trains. So, and it was actually pretty clever how he went about doing this. So, what he would do before he took a train trip is he would buy a really cheap hat. Now, he was always very well dressed, even when he really had no money. One thing, he was always really well dressed, but he would buy a very cheap hat. And now back then, sort of like today, when you would get, if you bought a ticket, then they would trade that ticket for the sort of stub that said that, this is where you sit. And so he would find a stub that somebody had thrown away, and he'd stick it into his hat. And then when he saw that the conductor was coming, he'd stick his head out the window as if he was watching what was going on, watching the world go by. And when the conductor would tap him, he would be so shocked that his hat would fall off, out the window and away. And he would turn to the conductor and say, yeah, that was my ticket. You startled me, now I lost my ticket. And the conductor would be like, okay, sorry, here, have a ticket, and you can stay here. And so that's why, for the price of a used hat, he managed to travel wherever he wanted to. You can imagine that things did not end well for Pohl. He died in a boarding house somewhere in southwest D.C., but what was interesting, he was living in a boarding house. He took ill there. He was actually taken to Providence Hospital, which is where he died shortly thereafter. The hospital, nobody had come to visit him, so they didn't know what to do with him, and all they knew is that he had no money. And so he was actually buried in a pauper's grave, which was actually not far from here. So we are very close to Reservation 13 here. Just past the cemetery is the jail, and then as you go up, that's all part of Reservation 13. And over the years, Reservation 13 was sort of the dumping ground for all of the things that we didn't want in the center of the city, like the jail, of course, but also the hospitals were built there, smallpox hospital, particularly the crematorium, and the paupers field. And so that's exactly where Hickman was buried. Now, he did have friends, and when these friends, they came to the boarding house and they discovered that Hickman had died, and found out that, he'd been buried in the paupers field, they were very worried. With good reason, because back then the resurrectionists were big in the city. Resurrectionists were men and women who would rob graves, and they would go and find fresh bodies that they would then sell to the universities, to the doctors teaching at universities in order to teach the students about anatomy. There was no legal way of doing that, of obtaining bodies back then, so resurrectionists was the way it worked. When they heard that Hickman had been buried there, they were very worried. They knew all about these resurrectionists, and they were worried that, in fact, this is what had happened to him as well. All right, we're back. Yes, we had some technical difficulties. I was worried about myself being out in the sun, but it turned out that the real problem was that the phone didn't like that. So anyway, apologize for that brief interruption, and I'll back up a little bit. Pohl Hickman, we're talking about Pohl Hickman, we're talking about how his friends went to the paupers field where he had been buried after his death, and when they got there, they saw that his grave had been robbed. The resurrectionists, as they were called, had cut a hole in the ground about 2 by 3 feet, dug down, broken the top of the coffin, taken a rope, wrapped that around Hickman's chest, and then pulls the body up and out. Unfortunately, they hadn't done a very good job of it, and so, maybe fortunately, because his head popped off as they did this. So when they got there, he was sort of half hanging out of the grave, he was hanging somewhere, lying somewhere else, and the resurrection's, of course, long gone. They had left what was left of Hickman there. So the friends gathered up the remains and brought him here to Congressional Cemetery for a proper burial with a proper gravestone. So very thankful to those friends because, as I said, Pohl Hickman is really one of my favorite characters. And clearly I'm not alone in this. A book was written about him after his death. It went through multiple editions over the next 10 years or so. So clearly I'm not the only person who's fascinated by Pohl Hickman. All right, we're going to head right over here and stay in the shade. Doggy doesn't want to go either. I understand that here. So this here is the Hitz family. John Hitz. and his whole family. In fact, if you were here for Soul Strolls last year, this was one of the stops there. But the reason why I'm intrigued by him is I think it was actually his daughter, who was a nurse, who was being portrayed last year. But I'm more intrigued by John himself. He had immigrated from Switzerland and has become a businessman here in Washington, but also become, as it says down here, actually right up here, right, is that he was the Consul General of Switzerland. It says it somewhere there, doesn't it? Yeah, here we go, Consul. And what does that mean, actually? Well, I discovered what it meant is that he spent much of the Civil War helping young Swiss citizens who had made the mistake of signing up for the Union Army get back out of the Union Army once they had realized what it was that they had signed up for, and that it wasn't all like bright shining uniforms and flashing guns. So that was Hitz's main job in that time. But of course, he lived a much longer, very long and successful life here in Washington, D.C. But his work during the Civil War saved the lives of many of his countrymen. Right, let's see. All right, let's figure out where we can go. Maybe underneath that tree there. And we'll go under that tree over there and work our way back. How's that? So last stop here, again, one of ones that I don't get a lot of chance to talk about a lot, but I do. But he's really one of the more famous people buried in Congressional Cemetery. That's Matthew Brady. So, in fact, the whole family is here, including Handy. If you look at the Library of Congress, oh yeah, that's nice here. There we go. The collection of his photographs that's in the Library of Congress collection, and can all be found if you Google Library of Congress pictures, the Brady Handy collection. So they were all interconnected. Matthew Brady made his name during the Civil War as a photographer. And in fact, most of the famous pictures of the Civil War, particularly the aftermath of battles and that sort of thing, were all due to his work. Well, he had a whole crew there, although I think one of the problems that people had with him is that he would take credit for work that had been done by other people. Also, of course, very famous for the portraits that he took of Lincoln, multiple portraits that he took. And he's well known for the fact that he's missing a T. It's Matthew with one T rather than two, for reasons. Anyway, Matthew Brady, in spite of sort of all of his fame and, of course, the incredible importance that his pictures have today in reconstructing the history of the Civil War, he died broke. And in fact, the story goes that late at night, you can see somebody roaming the halls of Congress in a beige duster, and that's Matthew Brady, still trying to get the money that he is owed, or that he feels that he is owed for his pictures. He'd actually sold or tried to sell his collection to the government, hadn't really been given the money that he thought he deserved, and so instead of sort of going on about his business and building up a business, he became sort of very focused on that. So kind of a sad end to a really sort of remarkable story. What I do like to see, I noticed today, people have left little cameras on top of the gravestones there, on the markers there, to honor Matthew Brady and his importance in photography. All right, I think that does it. All right, well, thanks for hanging in there. I apologize for the brief interruption there, but look forward to seeing you properly in Congressional Cemetery sometime in the near future. Bye-bye.